Today I'm going to talk about a new acquisition because rare book dealers live for new acquisition. There's an old adage in our business when somebody comes in, they say a lot of times, what's your favorite book? And the truthful answer is, it's the last book I acquired. So this is indeed the last book that I acquired, and it's really about the history of portraiture. When you imagine, it's so easy today to take for granted with the iPhone that we can snapshot every single moment and remember how everybody looked. But when you think about people's portraits going back to the 18th century, and you think of all these googly-eyed ancestor portraits, making an accurate portrait was an expensive endeavor. It was something usually reserved for the nobility, for wealthy people. And of course there were folk art and less expensive portraits that could be made of everyday people, but they weren't necessarily the most accurate representations of people. We would really have to wait until the 1840s with the popularization of the daguerreotype as a portrait for really accurate keepsakes. However, there was obviously a need for everyday portraits, especially miniature portraits, and silhouettes were extremely popular. They had invented the silhouette and used it since ancient times, but they increased in popularity and use in the late 18th century, the early 19th century. And out of that milieu of the silhouette, in 1789, Guy-Louis Chrétien invented something called the physiognotrace. Essentially, a sitter who wanted their portrait taken would go behind a wooden box and a piece of paper, and a light was placed, and they would have their picture very accurately traced. Then with that sheet and another mechanical device, the pantograph, which was essentially a series of parallelograms, you could retrace that, and it could be simultaneously and extraordinarily accurately etched onto a prepared copper plate. So you would have an instant miniaturization of the portrait you had just drawn. And from that copper plate, you could print beautiful aquatints. An aquatint is a type of intaglio engraving that is more concerned with tone rather than line in the etching. They were very popular during the period, and they became very famous, like in the prints of Audubon or in Goya's prints, for instance. But because they were very delicate, you could only print a small number of them before the plate was damaged. And in these instances, you could probably only print about a dozen or so of these small portraits. So, moving on. In 1793, escaping from the French Revolution, another Frenchman, Charles Balthazar Saint-Mémin, decided to come to America. At first, he tried to raise vegetables. That didn't work, thankfully. And he decided then to take up the art of portraiture on a commercial level, and he took the invention of the physiognoraph, and he went around New York and Philadelphia and places making very accurate miniature portraits of people, including Thomas Jefferson, Paul Revere, George Washington. And for every person that sat, he would provide them with a dozen examples of their work. This is actually a collection of his original portraits. There are about 120 of them in here, and they were collected probably about the turn of the century because somebody realized that they had to go around and get an example of each, as many as they could, and put them in these nice custom boxes. Destroyed with time, but thankfully the contents are well preserved. You can see some examples here I'll take out. This first one is Philip Van Cortlandt in 1796, a member of the House of Representatives in New York from Westchester. And you can just see how accurately the portrait is. It's practically a photograph, which is truly amazing in 1796. This other one here is beautifully framed and matted. Is an example of Peter Duponceau, the famous American linguist that helped us decipher written Chinese. This is one of my favorite ones. I believe that's his daughter. And this charming girl looks like out of the 1920s or 1930s. It's practically inconceivable that it could be so splendidly drawn like this and so accurately in the early 1800s. And finally, here's an example of Edmund Roots. I'm not exactly sure who Edmund Roots is. I'd have to look it up, but I can tell you I love the hair, and all of his roots are showing there. And it goes on for another 100 or so portraits. This was not the entire oeuvre of Saint-Mémin. In 1862, and I bought this with the collection, a book was published in America called the Saint-Mémin Collection of Portraits, 760 medallion portraits. And this has a wonderful introduction of how the book was produced, because after the artist returned to France in 1814, he retained for his private use single examples of the portraits that he had made in America. And when he died in, I think it's in 1852, these were passed on and then eventually sold in 1859 and brought to America, and this book was produced. Photographs of all of the portraits he retained were made for this book, so it's the single most comprehensive source of the portraits, and it really gave us the knowledge of how these were produced as well as his work. What's particularly remarkable about this is that they were indeed photographs of the collection, albumen photographs throughout. It makes this particular work one of the earliest American photo illustrated works, and certainly one of the most comprehensive. And only 100 copies of this particular book were produced. So a very important work in the history of American portraiture. It gives us the most interesting and accurate depiction of Americans during the Federal period. So that is my new acquisition. I haven't cataloged it yet, I haven't priced it yet, I have to do some more work on it, but I was very excited to share it with you. And those are some of the joys and discoveries of the book business. And I hope you will look at other episodes and subscribe.